The cold Boston night seeped through our windows, but the warmth of my smile was enough to keep it at bay. Marcus, my husband, had a plan. He was predictable, always had been. He believed that if he left for a supposed last-minute business trip, he'd take a taxi from the airport back home and catch me off guard, in bed with another man. He thought he knew me, but he had no idea the extent of my betrayal. My hands were cold, but not from nerves. It was the thrill, the shiver of knowing I was one step ahead. I looked at the clock on the wall, 10:30 p.m. By now he'd be in the taxi, his heart filled with a mix of hope and suspicion. I didn't feel guilty. Life with Marcus was like a dull December snow, cold and lifeless. He gave me a comfortable life, but never the passion I craved. The mansion in suburban Wellesley, the luxury car in the garage, the jewelry in the safe. It was all a payment, but it wasn't love. Not for me. To me, it was a golden cage. I deserved more, and he was the only one to blame. I walked to my bedroom, the moonlight illuminating the hardwood floor. On my phone, a message from Michael. "I'll be there in 5 minutes." Michael was the spark that Marcus had extinguished. Young, charming, and completely in love with me. I was wearing a black silk dress, a gift from Marcus that he never saw me wear. It was the irony of the situation, a touch of cruelty that I adored. I adjusted my hair and poured a glass of wine from the cellar. He thought he would catch me, but I would receive him with open arms. It was time to show him that the real villain of our story was me. I heard Michael's car stop in front of the house. I could hear Marcus's taxi approaching on the street. The stage was set. I just had to leave the curtains open. Michael's car pulled up in front of the house, punctual as ever. The headlights illuminated the living room, and I saw myself in the window's reflection, a glass of wine in my hand. Marcus's taxi was already turning the corner, its engine purring like a predatory cat. I knew he wouldn't ring the doorbell. He'd use the spare key he gave me for emergencies. It was just the kind of thing Marcus would do. I opened the door for Michael. He was wearing a leather jacket and had a smile that could melt the Boston snow. He hugged me, the scent of cologne and firewood filling my lungs. "You look beautiful," he whispered in my ear. "Thank you," I replied. But my eyes were on the street, waiting. The silence of the house was broken only by the sound of our shoes on the hardwood floor. I walked to the fireplace and lit the fire. The warmth spread through the room, a stark contrast to the cold outside. Michael sat on the leather sofa, and I sat beside him. He took my hand and kissed my cheek. I didn't move, just kept staring at the door. I could hear Marcus's footsteps outside. He was in the garden, maybe checking the windows for any lights on. The taxi's engine was already silent. I could feel the tension in the air, the blood rushing in my veins. I knew he was getting closer. I could smell his fear, the rage he was bottling up. The doorknob began to turn slowly. I let go of Michael's hand and turned to the door. "Welcome back, Marcus," I said with a smile. The door opened with a soft creak. Marcus's face was pale and rigid, a mask of shock and betrayal. He looked at me, then at Michael, and then back at me again. The wine glass in my hand trembled slightly. Michael stood up, but I stopped him with a gesture. I wanted him to stay, to witness the scene. Marcus looked older than I remembered. The wrinkles around his eyes and on his forehead had deepened, and his hair, which was already starting to gray, seemed even duller. He dropped the suitcase he was holding, and it hit the floor with a thud. I didn't expect this," he said, his voice a whisper. "I know," I replied, still smiling. The fire in the fireplace danced, painting shadows on the wall. The lights of the city of Boston, far away, twinkled like little diamonds. Michael was silent, just watching the scene unfold. He didn't feel guilty, I knew. He was just a pawn in my game. I didn't regret it. I didn't feel bad. I felt powerful. I had orchestrated the perfect scene. I had planned every detail, every move. "I gave you everything," he said, and I could feel the hate building in his voice. "You gave me a life you wanted, not a life I wanted," I replied. The words came from my lips like venom. I could taste their bitterness. I saw him turn to Michael. "Who are you?" he asked. "I'm the man she actually loves," Michael answered, without hesitation. Marcus turned back to me. He had nothing left to say. He just looked at me, and I saw the light in his eyes go out. The light that was once love was now just an empty void. The silence in the room was so heavy you could cut it with a knife. Marcus stood there, unable to react. His expression of shock had transformed into a silent, contained rage. He didn't shout. He didn't throw anything. He just stared at us, with a look that promised cold revenge. Michael, sensing the tension, stood up and put a hand on my shoulder. A gesture of protection I didn't actually need. I wasn't afraid of Marcus. He had always been a man of words, not action. "I'm leaving," he said, his voice so low we could barely hear him. He picked up his suitcase, turned his back on us, and walked out the front door. The sound of his footsteps echoed in the cold night air, and then the sound of his car engine, driving away. Michael looked at me, worried. "Are you okay?" he asked. "I'm great," I replied, still holding my wine glass. I was fine. In that moment, I felt more alive than ever before. There was no guilt, no regret. There was just the sweet satisfaction of finally taking control of my own life. I was finally free. Free from a life that was more of a routine than an existence. Free from a man who saw me as a possession, not a person. I didn't know what the future held, but in that moment, I didn't care. I had Michael. I had the mansion. And I had my freedom. There was nothing more I could want. And I knew that Marcus, somewhere in the cold Boston night, was feeling as lost as I had felt at the beginning of our story. I knew he would never be the same again. The weeks that followed were an avalanche of emotions. The house Marcus and I had shared became mine, a reflection of my new status. Michael, with his smile and his energy, filled it with life. He moved in, and the house that was once a silent tomb now echoed with laughter, music, and love. I felt complete, fulfilled. It was as if, for the first time, I was truly living. But life has a way of reminding us that actions have consequences. Marcus didn't come back. He didn't call, didn't text, didn't try to reconcile. Instead, he used silence as his weapon. He initiated the divorce proceedings, and I, naively, thought it would all be easy. But it wasn't. He hired the most expensive and ruthless lawyer in Boston. In our meetings with the lawyers, he was calm, cold, and completely impassive. He didn't argue, didn't fight. He just presented facts, documents, evidence. I watched, in horror, as he planned everything, every step. He knew about my affair with Michael for months. He had hired a private investigator who documented everything, every secret message, every secret meeting. The pictures were on the table, a testament to my betrayal. The lawyer presented a legal document, a prenuptial agreement I had signed years ago, when I was young and naive, blinded by the promise of a life of luxury. It stated that in the event of a divorce due to infidelity, I would lose everything. The house, the car, the jewelry, the bank accounts. Everything. I felt the ground sink beneath my feet. Marcus looked at me, and his eyes, which were once full of love and now full of hatred, seemed to say, "You asked for it." The divorce was a spectacle. The Boston newspapers covered every detail. painting me as the heartless villain who cheated on her loving, successful husband. My friends, the ones who were with me in the beginning, disappeared. They didn't want to be associated with me, the woman who had lost everything. The lawyers argued back and forth for weeks, but in the end, the prenuptial agreement was airtight. I had no choice but to sign. I lost the house, the car, the jewelry, everything. I had nothing but a few boxes of clothes and Michael. He was my last resort, my last hope. I was living with him in his small apartment in a working-class neighborhood. It was a stark contrast to the life I was used to. The walls were thin, the neighbors were noisy, and the food was cheap. Michael tried to be supportive, but I could see the stress in his eyes. He worked 2 jobs to support us, but it wasn't enough. We argued more often, mostly about money. The love that once was a fire now was just a faint spark, barely enough to keep us warm. I missed the quiet of the mansion, the comfortable silence, the certainty of my luxurious life. I missed Marcus. I didn't miss him as a person, but I missed what he represented: security, stability, a life without worries. I had traded a life of comfort for a life of passion, and now I had neither. My choices, my cruelty, my arrogance had led me to this path. I looked in the mirror, and I didn't recognize the woman I saw. Her eyes were empty. Her smile was gone. The villain of the story was now the victim of her own creation. My life with Michael became a series of challenges. The love that once felt so liberating now felt like a burden. The financial strain was immense, and the constant fighting was draining. I felt like I was drowning. And Michael, though he tried, couldn't save me. One day, I received a letter. It was from a law firm, a different one this time. I opened it with shaking hands. It was a demand for payment. A large payment. Marcus had filed a lawsuit against me. Not for the divorce, but for the company he had created with my initial investment. A company I didn't even know existed. He had used my money, the money he had given me, to start a small tech company that had exploded into a multi-million-dollar corporation. The letter stated that since I had signed the prenuptial agreement, I had no rights to the company. But since I was the one who had initiated the breakup, I was responsible for a portion of the initial investment. The amount was so large it was impossible for me to pay. I looked at the letter, and my heart sank. It wasn't about the money anymore. It was about revenge. Marcus was not just taking everything from me. He was making sure I would have nothing left to build a new life with. I stared at the letter, tears streaming down my face. Michael came in and saw the letter. He read it, and his face turned ashen. "How are we going to pay for this?" he asked. His voice was filled with fear. I had no answer. The monster I had created was now coming to devour me. The lawsuit became my new reality. Every morning I woke up with a knot in my stomach. The constant calls from lawyers, the endless paperwork, the feeling of impending doom. Michael and I were barely speaking. Our relationship, once a beacon of hope, had turned into a toxic battlefield. He blamed me for our situation, and I blamed him for not being able to support me. The love we once shared had completely vanished, replaced by resentment and despair. One evening, after a particularly harsh argument, Michael packed his things. He looked at me, his eyes full of a sadness I had never seen before. "I can't do this anymore," he said. "I can't. This is too much." I begged him to stay, to fight with me, but he had already made up his mind. He walked out, and the door slammed shut behind him. The silence that followed was deafening. I was alone, truly alone. The house that once was filled with laughter and love was now just an empty apartment, filled with the ghosts of my past. I sat on the floor, the lawsuit papers scattered around me, and I finally understood. I had orchestrated a beautiful, cruel tragedy, and now I was the one paying the price. Marcus had not only taken my material possessions, but he had also taken my reputation, my relationships, my future. He had left me with nothing, and I had nobody to blame but myself. The next day, I went to the law office. I was tired of fighting. I was tired of the pain. I wanted it all to end. I walked into the office of Marcus's lawyer, a man with cold eyes and a cruel smile. He looked at me, a villainous grin on his face. "Well, well," he said. "Look who's here." I didn't respond. I just handed him a document. It was a declaration of bankruptcy. I had nothing left to give, nothing left to lose. I had lost the house, the car, the jewelry. I had lost Michael, my friends, my reputation. Now I was losing the last thing I had, my dignity. The lawyer looked at the document, and the smile on his face disappeared. He had won, but I wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of seeing me break. I looked him in the eyes, and I said, "You can have it all. I have nothing left to give." I walked out of the office, and the world seemed to have a new color, a color of gray. The city of Boston, once a symbol of my freedom and power, was now a symbol of my defeat. I walked the streets, a ghost among the living. I saw couples holding hands, laughing, and I felt a pang of a pain so deep I couldn't breathe. I had everything, and I threw it all away for a fleeting moment of passion, for a cruel act of revenge. Now, I had nothing. I returned to my empty apartment. The silence was my only company. I sat in a corner, hugging my knees, and I finally cried. The tears weren't of self-pity, but of realization. I realized that my life had been a lie. I was a villain, yes, but not a powerful one. I was a selfish, naive woman who had confused wealth with power and love with possession. I had tried to control the narrative of my life, but in the end, the narrative had controlled me. The past was a cruel ghost that haunted me, and the future was a dark, endless tunnel. One evening, I received a message from a familiar number. It was Marcus. He had sent me a picture of the old mansion in Wellesley, now empty, quiet, with a for sale sign in the front yard. He didn't write anything, just the picture. It was a final message, a final act of cruelty. He was leaving. He was starting a new life, and I was left behind in the ashes of my old life. I looked at the picture, and I felt nothing. No anger, no sadness, just a profound, empty void. My revenge, my plan, my arrogance had led me to this moment. I was a villain without an audience, a queen without a kingdom. The cold Boston night was my final embrace. I was alone, a ghost in my own story. My final scene, a woman without a past, without a future. A villain with no one to blame but herself.